Beneath the smoke and ruins of a world at war, there were stories too dark, too fragile, to survive the history books. Whispers of ghost convoys, forgotten voices, and cities that burned from within. Step into the shadows where spies traded lives for secrets, where music defied death, and where the echoes of war still haunt the coldest nights. But be warned, once you hear these stories, you can't unhear them. History will no longer feel safe. The North Atlantic in winter was a place where ships disappeared into fog as easily as whispers into the night. Sailors called it the Grey Graveyard, where even the most hardened men felt the cold press into their bones, and every wave carried the taste of danger. In December 1943, British naval intelligence intercepted a strange series of coded transmissions off the coast of Greenland. The messages were faint, riddled with static, and repeated the same haunting name, Convoy Lament. What puzzled the Admiralty was simple. No such convoy was scheduled, and all official Allied convoys were accounted for. Suspecting a new German deception or a rogue supply line, the Royal Navy dispatched a small task force to investigate, led by the veteran destroyer HMS Resolute, with a handful of corvettes and a Canadian frigate. Commander Arthur Callaway of the Resolute had spent 3 years in the Battle of the Atlantic, and had seen enough of the war to distrust both the ocean and his own luck. The convoy route they followed north was unusual, hugging the icebergs of the Denmark Strait, a path few dared to take because the seas there were unpredictable and German long-range reconnaissance aircraft occasionally patrolled from occupied Norway. Yet the transmissions kept drawing them closer to the Arctic Circle. On the 4th day, the weather worsened, howling winds, snow cutting like knives, and then a lookout shouted from the bridge. There, looming through the mist, were 3 hulking shapes fused into drifting ice, the skeletal remains of merchant ships, their bows ruptured and their decks coated in white frost like tombstones in a frozen cemetery. A boarding party went out under perilous conditions, hacking through ice to climb the side of the first ship, the SS Montrose. Inside, silence reigned. Meals half-eaten were still frozen on mess tables, bunks empty yet neatly made. Logbooks told the story. Convoy Lament had departed Halifax 2 months prior with the goal of creating a silent convoy, an experimental attempt to slip through the Atlantic by avoiding known convoy lanes. The plan was to skirt the Arctic, evading wolf packs and Luftwaffe patrols. But nature and war had conspired against them. Ice trapped the ships in late November, and before the Royal Navy could respond, Heinkel He 111 bombers swooped in from Norway, setting one vessel ablaze and crippling the others. Survivors' notes indicated a desperate march across the ice, but no bodies were ever found, only lifeboats shattered along floes. The discovery shook the men of the Resolute. To sail the Atlantic was to gamble against U-boats and storms, but to vanish without a whisper was the nightmare of every sailor. The task force spent 2 days combing the surrounding seas for any trace of the crew. Only one fragment of human life surfaced. A frozen diary page sealed in a tin box, written by First Officer Samuel Briggs of the SS Montrose. His final entry read, "The ice does not forgive. We hear engines above the clouds. If we do not reach the shore, may the sea remember our names." The page, later preserved in a Halifax Naval Museum, became the sole testament of the doomed experiment. The Admiralty quietly classified the incident, worried that public knowledge of Convoy Lament would sow fear among merchant sailors already burdened by the longest continuous battle of the war. Officially, the ships were listed as lost at sea. Among the sailors of the Atlantic Fleet, however, rumors spread quickly. They said that in certain fogs, north of Greenland, a sailor might glimpse the outlines of frozen freighters drifting silently, and that their radios still whispered on the wind. Some swore they heard the Morse code signals late at night, faint as a heartbeat, calling for a rescue that would never come. In later years, after the war ended and U-boats rested on the seabed, the legend of the ghost convoy endured as both caution and memorial. Naval historians debated whether the mission had been a brilliant idea fatally executed or an unnecessary gamble with lives. But for the men who braved those northern waters, the story lived on in simpler terms. It was a reminder that in the Battle of the Atlantic, the enemy was not always a submarine or a bomber. Sometimes, it was the ocean itself, endless, merciless, and waiting to claim its due. Warsaw in 1941 was a city carved into silence. The German occupation had turned its streets into corridors of fear, and the ghetto walls pressed in like the sides of a coffin. Within this suffocating world lived Elior Weissman, a 42-year-old violinist who had once filled Warsaw's grand halls with music. Before the war, he had performed with the Warsaw Philharmonic, his concerts drawing both the elite and the common people. But now his life had narrowed to a single attic in the ghetto, where the only audience was the cold air and the occasional scurrying rat. His violin, a weathered Guarneri copy, was all he had left from his former world, a fragile piece of beauty in a city crumbling under boots and gunfire. Every night, despite the danger, Weissman would take his violin to the window and play. At first, it was a quiet rebellion, a way to remind himself that he was still human in a place designed to erase humanity. But soon, whispers spread among the ghetto's secret circles. The violinist's music was more than solace, it was signal. Members of the Polish Home Army had realized that Weissman's final note each night could mark the safe time for couriers to cross alleys or pass messages to the resistance. The system was simple. A long note meant wait, a short, sharp note meant go. Weissman became an unwitting accomplice at first, but when a young courier named Marek approached him with trembling hands and whispered, "Your music saves lives," he understood the stakes. From then on, his playing became a nightly oath. Life in the ghetto continued to rot around him. People vanished in roundups. Hunger gnawed at children until they no longer cried. In the winter of 1942, Weissman's sister, the last of his family, was taken during a deportation to Treblinka. He never saw her again. That night, he played a mournful Hebrew melody that drifted beyond the walls, across the frozen streets. Some said German soldiers paused to listen, though none dared intervene. His notes were both funeral and defiance. In April 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto erupted in the uprising that would shake the Nazi occupiers with its audacity. By then, Weissman had fully embraced his role as the invisible herald of resistance. The attic became a lookout, his violin a shield made of song. He watched smoke curl from burning buildings as he played a rapid series of sharp notes, the signal for fighters to retreat toward the next barricade. Bullets tore the air, but his music did not stop until the very last night he was free. German troops eventually traced one of the resistance movements back to his block. They dragged him from the attic, the violin clutched to his chest, and shoved him into the line of prisoners being marched to the Umschlagplatz. Witnesses said he refused to drop the instrument even as rifle butt struck his ribs. Weissman was deported to Treblinka, where records vanish and memory must speak in their place. His violin did not follow him to the camp. A German officer kept it, amused by the story of the playing Jew, and later carried it into retreat when the tide of war turned. 2 years later, in 1945, a French soldier stumbled upon that violin in an abandoned Bavarian farmhouse. Carved into the inside was a faint scratch, EW, the only signature he ever left behind. Decades after the war, the violin found its way to a small museum in Warsaw. Visitors walk past the glass case and often pause, reading the inscription about the man who played in defiance of silence. For the elderly survivors, the memory of his music lingers like smoke, soft, haunting, and impossible to erase. They say that on certain winter nights, when the wind winds through the old ghetto streets, one can almost hear a single violin, whispering to a city that refused to bow. Elior Weissman left no grave, but his melody outlived the walls that tried to contain it. Lisbon in 1942 was a city of shadows. Neutral Portugal had become the unlikely meeting ground for the world's secret wars, where Allied and Axis agents brushed shoulders in cafes, and every harbor tavern seemed to hide a listening ear. The cobblestone streets of the Alfama district were alive at night with fado music, the mournful songs of the sea, but beneath the notes lingered the quiet hiss of espionage. It was here that Operation Lantern began, a joint mission between Britain's Special Operations Executive and America's fledgling Office of Strategic Services. Its goal was simple on paper: intercept Axis couriers using Lisbon as a neutral ground to pass microfilms and coded documents back to Berlin. In practice, it was a dangerous chess game played on streets lined with spies. Among the operatives was Isabella Duarte, a nightclub singer whose smoky voice had made her a darling of the city's night scene. By day she performed at the Estrella do Mar, a modest club by the harbor where sailors and foreign attaches gathered to drink and forget the war. By night, she was an SOE asset, smuggling microfilms in sheet music and relaying messages to Allied handlers. Her code name was Lantern, a reference to the small, flickering lights used by fishermen along the Tagus River, a signal in the dark for those who knew where to look. Few would suspect that the woman crooning Portuguese ballads about lost love was also monitoring which guests lingered too long at the bar, or which ones left behind envelopes sealed with wax marked by the Reichsadler. Her counterpart in the mission was Karl Heinemann, an aware officer who had grown disillusioned with the Nazi regime after witnessing atrocities on the Eastern Front. Under the guise of a German courier, he fed the Allies critical information about U-boat refueling schedules and the movements of supply ships in the Atlantic. He and Duarte never met in public more than necessary, often communicating by leaving music scores with invisible ink messages under the piano at Estrella do March. But their cooperation would soon be tested by the very city that thrived on double-dealing. One foggy November night, a tip reached the SOE safehouse. A high-value Axis courier was passing through Lisbon carrying plans for Operation Teufel, an apparent German initiative involving sabotage of Allied positions in the Mediterranean. The microfilm, according to Heinemann, would be transported in a diplomatic pouch hidden aboard a neutral Portuguese freighter preparing to depart for Naples. Operation Lantern moved into action. Duarte performed that evening as usual, her voice gliding through the room as two plainclothes agents slipped toward the harbor. Across the street, Gestapo observers watched the club's entrance, oblivious to the fact that her final note, a high, trembling C, was the signal to commence the interception. The ensuing operation was a blend of daring and luck. Disguised as dockworkers, SOE agents boarded the freighter at midnight under the pretense of a last-minute cargo inspection. In the captain's quarters, they discovered a false-bottomed drawer containing the microfilm reels and coded correspondence bound for Rome. But just as they secured the evidence, headlights swept across the pier. German agents had been tipped off. A brief firefight erupted in the fog, bullets snapping against the metal hull of the freighter. One agent was wounded, but they managed to vanish into the warren of Lisbon's backstreets, aided by Duarte guiding them through alleys she knew since childhood. The microfilm, once decrypted, revealed that Operation Teufel had been a plan to sabotage the Suez Canal with disguised mines, a scheme already in its late stages of preparation. Thanks to Operation Lantern, the Allies rerouted convoys and increased patrols, effectively nullifying the threat. Portugal's neutral government quietly looked the other way, preferring ignorance to confrontation, and Lisbon returned to its usual rhythm of clandestine deals and whispered betrayals. For Duarte and Heinemann, the mission was both triumph and farewell. The German defector vanished from Lisbon weeks later, reportedly exfiltrated to England, while Duarte continued to sing as though nothing had changed. Her father's songs grew heavier in tone, carrying a private burden she could never confess. After the war, declassified reports revealed the scale of Lisbon's hidden war and the quiet success of Operation Lantern. Today, historians speak of the city as Europe's silent chessboard, a place where a single song and a smuggled piece of microfilm could change the course of distant battles. In the smoke-filled memory of Estrella do Mar, the voice of Isabella Duarte still lingers, reminding those who listen that wars are not always fought with guns, but with whispers and a steady heart in the dark. The city of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 was less a city and more a scar carved into the earth. Smoke rose from skeletons of factories, the Volga River was crusted with ice and blood, and the air carried the bitter scent of ash and gunpowder. Amid this wasteland, a small Soviet detachment known as Brigade 47B clung to survival in a bombed-out tractor factory. Their task was unusual. They were not frontline soldiers but tank mechanics, assigned to repair crippled T-34s and keep the city's armored heart beating. When the German 6th Army encircled the city, supply lines were severed, reinforcements ceased, and the mechanics became accidental warriors in the deadliest urban battle of the war. Sergeant Mikhail Borodin, a burly man with hands hardened by years of factory work, led the ragtag group of 12. They had started the battle with tools, not rifles, but as the front shifted to the factory walls, their workshop became both fortress and graveyard. The men scavenged wrecks from the streets, dragging in crippled T-34 hulls and stripped German Panzer IVs under the cover of night. They called the yard their steel orchard, where dead machines were planted and, through sweat and ingenuity, reborn to fight again. Borodin became a blacksmith of war, welding scavenged armor plates, replacing engines with mismatched parts, and even mounting salvaged German machine guns onto Soviet hulls. One of their creations, a Frankenstein tank built from 2 T-34s and a Panzer turret, became a local legend known as the Stalingrad Mule. It was slow and ugly, but it could fire, and that was enough. For 60 days, Brigade 47B held a single factory block against German patrols, ambushing them in the night with their patched-up monsters. Each successful strike meant another day of survival. Each failure brought death closer. The city's echo was constant, the whine of Stukas, the boom of artillery, and the distant cries of men who would never see another dawn. Food ran out first, then ammunition. The men stripped leather belts to boil into broth, rationed breadcrumbs like diamonds, and counted every shell as if it were gold. When German infantry probed their sector, the mechanics became snipers and saboteurs, firing from windows and setting booby traps with fuel barrels and mines scavenged from wrecks. Snow fell black with soot, and each man carried the weight of both hunger and fear. In the rare moments of quiet, Borodin would sit on the frozen floor of the factory and run his hand along the steel of a tank, whispering to it like a farmer tending his last crops in a dying field. By January 1943, the 6th Army was crumbling under Soviet encirclement. Brigade 47B had shrunk to 5 survivors, all gaunt shadows of the men who entered the factory months before. When the Red Army finally broke into their sector, they emerged like ghosts from the ruins, carrying rifles that barely worked. Soviet propaganda would later claim that the factory fighters destroyed dozens of German tanks, painting them as larger-than-life heroes. The truth, preserved in Borodin's post-war diary, was quieter and heavier. 3 confirmed kills, 2 makeshift tanks that burned before firing a shot, and 12 men who did their duty until the city swallowed them. After the war, the story of the steel orchard became a footnote in the grand narrative of Stalingrad, overshadowed by generals and divisions. Yet for the survivors, the memory of that frozen factory lived forever. In 1962, Borodin returned to the site, now a memorial, and found a single rusted track half buried in the earth. He kept it in his garden, among his apple trees, telling his grandchildren that it came from a place where steel once grew, watered by fire and blood. The orchard of Stalingrad never bloomed in life, but in memory, it bore the unyielding fruit of survival. The night of March 9, 1945, began with an unnatural stillness over Tokyo. For months, the city had known the wail of air raid sirens and the distant hum of American B-29 bombers. But tonight the silence seemed like a held breath. In a cramped NHK radio studio, 29-year-old broadcaster Aya Nakahara adjusted her headphones and scanned the evening's script. It was a routine weather bulletin, wrapped in layers of government censorship. She had learned long ago that truth was dangerous. The War Ministry allowed only optimism to pass through the airwaves, even as the city's wooden heart waited like tinder for the spark of firebombs. At 10:30 p.m., the first air raid sirens shattered the illusion of calm. Nakahara paused mid-broadcast as the studio windows rattled. In the distance, a low rumble grew, a sound she would later compare to rolling thunder. But this thunder came from hundreds of B-29s, flying in formation, their bomb bays loaded with incendiaries. Operation Meeting House had begun. Within minutes, the eastern districts of Tokyo erupted into walls of flame, and the studio lights flickered as the city's power grid buckled. Government censors barked at her to continue reading the official script, but the words caught in her throat. She could smell the smoke even here, blocks from the first firestorms. By 11 p.m., the city outside had become a living inferno. Wind carried embers across the Sumida River, igniting new neighborhoods as if the fire itself had wings. Nakahara made a choice that defied everything she had been taught. She pushed the script aside and began to speak to the people directly. "This is Tokyo," she said, her voice trembling. "The fires are everywhere. The river is full of people. Children are crying. If you can hear me, find water, cover your mouths, and stay low to the ground." Her words were raw, unapproved, and human, an island of honesty amid the sea of propaganda. Unbeknownst to her, Allied listening stations in the Pacific intercepted her broadcast. American radio operators, hardened by months of war, fell silent as her voice cut through the static, a single woman narrating the end of her city in real time. For the next hour, she continued to speak between coughing fits as smoke seeped into the studio. She described families huddled in canals to escape the flames, the fire-driven winds lifting tiles from rooftops, and the metallic taste of ash that coated her tongue. Her final words, as recalled in a post-war transcript, were almost a whisper: "The sky is burning. Tokyo is burning. Remember us." The studio went silent shortly after midnight. Whether the building finally caught fire or she fled into the chaos, no one knows for certain. Nakahara was never officially accounted for in the post-war census. Some believe she perished in the firebombing, one of the estimated 100,000 civilians killed that night. Others claim she survived and disappeared into the countryside, living the rest of her life in anonymity to avoid both American and Japanese authorities. Her fate remains one of the many mysteries left in the ashes. When the war ended and occupation forces sifted through Japan's shattered broadcasting records, a fragment of Nakahara's transmission was discovered on a damaged recording disc. The Americans archived it, labeling it Tokyo Civilian Broadcast, March 9 to 10, 1945. Decades later, historians would call it one of the most haunting civilian artifacts of the war. Unlike speeches of leaders or the metallic clatter of military reports, it was a voice from the fire itself, unfiltered and unafraid in its final moments. Today, a copy of that broadcast resides in the U.S. National Archives. Scholars and war museum visitors sometimes listen to it in darkened rooms, hearing the soft, cracking voice of Aya Nakahara. Outside, the world moves on, bright and bustling, far from that night of fire. But for a few minutes, as the recording hums and the whisper of the flames returns through time, listeners are transported to a city on the edge of annihilation, and to a young woman who chose truth over safety. In that fragile voice, Tokyo still burns, and the memory of its last broadcast lingers like smoke in the air. The fire has faded, the battles ended, and the victors wrote their clean versions of history, but these shadows remain. A violin still cries in empty streets, steel sleeps beneath frozen rivers, and a voice lost to smoke whispers across time. These stories were never meant for comfort. They are the hidden pulse of a world that nearly destroyed itself. Close the box if you wish, but know that its echoes will follow you into the dark.